For the last 8 months, I told myself it was fine, that I was being too sensitive, that this was what it meant to love your child unconditionally. You swallow the small humiliations. You keep quiet at the dinner table. You pretend not to notice. What I didn't tell anyone, not even my old buddy from the Navy, was that I had already called my attorney 3 weeks before any of it came to a head. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed contractor and built a business from nothing but a truck and a tool belt. And I own a 4-bedroom colonial in Asheville, North Carolina that I paid off completely in 2019. I want you to remember that detail. The house was paid off. My name on the deed. Nobody else's. After my wife passed. Cancer 3 years ago. Fast and cruel the way it always is. I rattled around in that house alone for about a year before my daughter called and said she and her husband were having some financial trouble. She asked if they could stay with me for a little while, just until they got back on their feet. I said yes without hesitating because that's what you do. That's what she needed. And honestly, I was lonely. The house was too quiet. Her husband. I'll be straightforward. I never fully trusted him. Not because he'd done anything specific, but because in 20 years of reading people on job sites, you develop a sense. He had the kind of smile that arrived a half second too late. Always looked like he was calculating something. My daughter loved him, so I kept those thoughts to myself. They moved in on a Saturday in October. My daughter brought her 2 cats in about 40 cardboard boxes, and her husband brought mostly opinions. The first few months were fine. Uncomfortable, the way all cohabitation is uncomfortable, but manageable. I cooked dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. I stayed out of their way. I gave them the second largest bedroom, right next to the master bath. I figured the arrangement was temporary, and I could be generous for a little while. Then spring came and things shifted. It started with small things. Her husband began making comments at dinner about the house being underutilized, about how the layout wasn't efficient. He worked in real estate, residential sales. And I think that profession has a way of making a man see every space as a transaction rather than a home. He said things like, if you converted the back porch, you'd really add value. I smiled and changed the subject. Then my daughter told me she was pregnant. I was genuinely happy. I hugged her right there in the kitchen, and I think I teared up a little, which I don't do easily. A grandchild. Something I'd wanted since my wife got sick, because she had wanted it so much and never got to see it. I held on to that happiness. It lasted about 3 weeks. One evening in April, the three of us were having dinner. Pot roast, something I'd been slow cooking all day, and my son-in-law put down his fork and said very casually, as if he were discussing a refinancing option, that they were going to need the master bedroom. I looked at him. For the baby, he said. We need the bigger room, and the ensuite, for nighttime feedings, with a setup. It just makes more sense. I said slowly, that's my bedroom. He said, right, but you're one person. You don't need that much space. My daughter was looking down at her plate. I asked her if this was something she wanted too, and she said quietly that it would really help them, that they needed the space, that I had the guest room, which was perfectly comfortable, the guest room where I had hosted my wife's sister for Thanksgiving visits, where I kept the boxes from my wife's belongings that I hadn't been able to open yet. I said I needed to think about it. Her husband said in the same flat tone, we'd really appreciate it if you decided soon. We want to get the nursery set up. I excused myself from the table and went outside and sat on the back porch steps and looked at the yard my wife had planted, the hydrangeas she'd put in along the fence. I sat there for a long time. I want to be honest about what happened in me during those weeks. There was grief, yes, the kind that sneaks up on you in practical moments when you're being told to vacate your own bedroom and you think, she would never have let this happen. But there was also something else, something quieter and colder, a decision forming. I didn't move out of my bedroom, but I also didn't fight. I just watched. What I noticed was this. My son-in-law had been spending a lot of time on the phone in the driveway. He would take calls out there and pace, which I could see from my office window on the second floor. I also noticed that some of my mail financial statements specifically had been opened and resealed not very carefully. I noticed that he had asked me twice in what he thought was casual conversation whether I had a will and who my attorney was. I have been in business for 3 decades. I know when someone is casing a job. I called my attorney, a woman I've worked with for 15 years, meticulous and unsentimental, exactly what you want. And I told her what was happening. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, I think we should update your estate documents, and I think we should do it this week. We did. I also called my accountant and we moved some things around. Nothing dramatic, just organized. And then I started writing things down. Dates, conversations, what was said, who was present, what time it was. I kept a small notebook in my truck that my son-in-law had never been in. The confrontation I had been expecting came on a Tuesday in June. I had been out most of the day meeting with a former client who wanted some renovation work quoted. I came home around 6 in the evening and found them both sitting in the living room waiting. They had the look of people who had rehearsed. My son-in-law started. He said the current situation wasn't working, that they needed more stability, that given the baby coming, they needed to know they had a real home, not just a temporary arrangement. He said, and I remember this precisely, that it wasn't fair for them to be guests in a house this size. He said that he had been looking at the finances and that they simply couldn't afford to rent anything in Asheville right now, and that the most practical solution was for me to move into the guest room permanently. He paused and then he said, or, honestly, you might be more comfortable somewhere smaller, an apartment maybe, something easier to manage at your age. My daughter said nothing. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, is this what you want? She said, we just need stability, Dad. That word, stability, from my daughter in my house looking at the floor. I said, okay, let me think about it overnight. He looked like he'd expected more resistance. He said, we'd really like an answer soon. I said, tomorrow. I went upstairs. I did not sleep much, but I was not panicking. I was thinking very clearly. The next morning, before either of them was awake, I drove to my attorney's office. She had a document ready that I'd asked her to prepare 2 weeks earlier, just in case. We went through it. I signed where I needed to sign. Then I went to my bank. Then I came home and I made coffee and I waited. They came downstairs around 9. My son-in-law had the confident look of a man who had already drafted a victory speech. He sat down across from me and said, so, did you think about it? I said, I did. He leaned forward slightly. I said, I want to tell you both something, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. I told them that I understood they were under financial pressure. I told them that I loved my daughter and I was looking forward to being a grandfather. I told them that I had no interest in making anyone's life harder. And then I told them that 18 months ago, before they moved in, I had put the house into a revocable living trust. That the terms of that trust were very specific about residency rights and disposition of the property. That my attorney had reviewed everything yesterday and confirmed that the current arrangement, them living here under informal agreement, carried no legal weight. That if I chose to end the arrangement, I could do so with 30 days written notice per North Carolina landlord-tenant law, since they had been here long enough to establish tenancy. My son-in-law's face changed, not all at once, like a building settling. I told him I had also spoken with my bank and placed a fraud alert on my accounts after noticing that my financial mail had been opened. My daughter said, Dad. I said, let me finish. I told them I was not asking them to leave. I told them I did not want that. What I wanted was clarity. I wanted a formal written agreement drawn up by my attorney, that established what they were contributing to household expenses, what the timeline looked like, and what rights and responsibilities everyone had. I told him that living under the same roof required honesty, and that I had not been feeling a lot of honesty lately. I slid a copy of the draft agreement across the table my attorney had prepared it the previous week. My son in law looked at it for a long time without touching it. My daughter picked it up. She read the first page. Her face was hard to read. Then something shifted in it. Not anger, but something more like recognition. She put it down and looked at her husband. She said, "Did you open his mail?" He said, "That's not." She said, "Did you open his mail?" The silence that followed told her what she needed to know. What happened next took several weeks, not several minutes. These things don't resolve neatly at a kitchen table. My daughter was upset at her husband, at the situation, at herself, I think, for not having seen more clearly what had been happening. They were hard conversations. There were nights where nobody talked. There was one evening where she came to the back porch and sat with me and cried, and I just let her, because sometimes that's what a parent does. Her husband eventually admitted that he had been looking into whether he could add his name to the deed using a process he'd read about. Adverse possession, of all things, which doesn't apply here and never would have worked. But the fact that he'd researched it told me everything I needed to know about the nature of his interest in my home. He moved out in July. My daughter stayed. We worked through it the way you work through most hard things, slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of coffee and some nights that went too long. She signed the household agreement. She signed the household agreement. She started contributing to utilities and groceries. She got a part-time position with a pediatric clinic downtown while she figured out the next steps. She was, underneath all of it, my daughter, the girl who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from job sites when she was 7, just worn out from following me around all day. Her son was born in November, 8 pounds 2 ounces. They let me in the room right after. I stood there holding him, this small, brand new, completely unimpressed person, and I thought about my wife and how she would have given anything to be standing where I was standing. I thought about the hydrangeas out back. I thought about a Tuesday morning in June when I had sat quietly across a kitchen table from a man who thought he had figured me out. I had spent 31 years in construction. I knew the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one. I knew what the structure was before I ever picked up a tool. My grandson looked up at me with that particular unfocused newborn stare, like he was deciding something important. I told him his grandmother would have spoiled him rotten, and I meant it as the highest possible compliment. I've been thinking about that pot roast dinner for a long time now. Not because of what was said, though I remember every word, but because of what I didn't say. There was a version of me, maybe 10 years younger, who would have gotten loud, who would have pushed back at the table and made it ugly and salt nothing. Instead, I excused myself, walked outside, and sat with my wife's hydrangeas in the dark. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that actually worked. What my son-in-law didn't understand, what I think a lot of people miss when they look at someone my age and see an easy target, is that 64 years of living teaches you to read a situation before you react to it. I'd spent 3 decades on job sites where one wrong move could bring a wall down. You learn patience. You learn to look at the whole structure before you touch anything. When I noticed my mail had been opened, I didn't confront him. I wrote it down in a notebook I kept in my truck. When he started asking about my will, I didn't get defensive. I called my attorney. That's not cleverness for its own sake. It's what happens when you've learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that preparation outlasts anger every single time. I think about my daughter and all of this too. She wasn't a villain. She was a woman who loved a man who turned out to have poor character, and she let herself get carried along by it longer than she should have. What shifted things for her wasn't me getting angry or issuing ultimatums. It was one quiet moment at a kitchen table when she picked up a piece of paper, read the first page, and asked her husband a question he couldn't answer honestly. She found her own footing. I didn't drag her there. That mattered to me more than any legal document. The hardest part of the whole thing, if I'm being honest, was the loneliness of those months when I was watching and waiting and not saying anything. There's a particular kind of endurance required when you're playing a long game, when you know what's happening but you can't show your hand yet. It wears on you. Some nights I sat on those back porch steps and I genuinely wasn't sure I was doing the right thing. I wondered if I was being too calculating, too cold, but I kept coming back to this. The alternative was to blow it all up and lose everything, including my daughter. So I held on. What I know now is that the outcome we want almost never arrives through the door we expected. My son in law thought he was dealing with a tired old man who would take whatever was offered. He was wrong about that. But the reason he was wrong wasn't luck. It was 31 years of showing up, building something real, finishing what I started, and paying attention to the difference between a load bearing wall and one that was just decorative. My grandson is 4 months old now. He doesn't know any of this yet. Someday, maybe, I'll tell him. I'll tell him that your word matters, that how you treat people when you think you have leverage over them is who you actually are, and that the most powerful thing a person can do in almost any situation is stay calm, think clearly, and not let someone else's bad character determine your next move. The hydrangeas came back this spring. My wife planted them to last. Some things, if you tend them right, just do.